The blizzard of 1853 hit the Montana Territory settlement with a fury that old-timers would talk about for decades. Moira Callahan stood in her doorway watching snow slide off her thick golden roof like water off oiled canvas, while 300 yards away, Fergus McLeod's cabin groaned under the weight of 3 feet of accumulation before part of his roof collapsed inward with a crack that echoed across the white landscape. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1853 brought cold that froze spit before it hit the ground, and wind that found every gap in every cabin across the territorial settlement. But it was the snow that tested everything the settlers had built. It came in waves through December and January, each storm adding another layer to roofs already straining under impossible weight. Men climbed ladders in freezing temperatures to shovel snow from bark-covered roofs and shake shingled structures that groaned and shifted with every added inch. Some cabins leaked, others developed dangerous sags in their roof lines. A few simply gave up under the pressure. Moira Callahan's cabin looked different from everything else in the settlement, where her neighbors had roofs covered in overlapping bark strips or carefully split wooden shakes. Moira's roof was thick with bundled pine needles laid in dense, overlapping layers that created a golden brown thatch nearly a foot thick. The peak rose sharply, much steeper than standard construction, and the entire surface had a shaggy, almost wild appearance that caught the low winter sun and glowed amber in the morning light. Extended eaves projected 2 feet beyond the walls, and the whole structure looked more like something from an old country illustration than practical frontier building. The settlement had mocked that roof. For 8 months, from the spring of 1852 through the first snows of that winter, men had made jokes about the widow gathering pine needles like a squirrel hoarding acorns. They had called it Callahan's Folly and the Needlewoman's Madness. Fergus McLeod, whose cabin stood closest to Moira's, had been particularly vocal in his criticism. He had told anyone who would listen that the widow had lost her mind to grief and was wasting her time on a roof that would blow apart in the first strong wind or rot into useless mulch by the following spring. But the roof did not blow apart. It did not rot. And when the January blizzard arrived with wind that stripped bark from trees and snow that fell so thick you could not see 20 feet in any direction, Moira's roof performed like nothing else in the settlement. Snow accumulated on its surface for perhaps half an hour before the steep pitch and the slippery texture of the densely packed pine needles sent it sliding off in smooth sheets. The accumulation never built up. The weight never became dangerous. And inside her cabin, with her small fire burning steadily, Moira stayed warmer than she had any right to be while using half the firewood her neighbors burned through. When Fergus McLeod's roof gave way on the second day of the blizzard, sending a section of bark and supporting poles crashing into his living space and letting wind and snow pour through the gap, he came to Moira's door with his wife and 3 children. She took them in without comment. Her cabin held the heat. Her roof held the snow at bay. And the innovation that everyone had mocked for 8 months suddenly became the only thing standing between 3 families and the killing cold outside. 14 months earlier, in April of 1852, Duncan and Moira Callahan had lived in a standard frontier cabin with a bark-covered roof that leaked in 3 places during heavy rain. They had built it together the previous year, following the same methods every other settler used. Cut logs, notch corners, stack walls, lay pole rafters, cover everything with overlapping strips of bark peeled from nearby trees. The work took 6 days. The result was adequate shelter that kept out most weather and provided a dry place to sleep. Duncan was a capable man, strong and practical, with the kind of steady competence that made him valuable to the small settlement. He helped neighbors with building projects, shared tools, and never complained about the hard work that frontier life demanded. Moira had married him in Ohio 3 years earlier, and they had come west together looking for land and opportunity. They found both in the Montana Territory, along with isolation, harsh weather, and the constant need to maintain everything they built against the relentless decay that came from exposure to the elements. That April morning started like dozens of others. Duncan planned to repair winter damage to their roof. Ice and wind had lifted several bark strips, and water had gotten underneath, rotting some of the underlying poles. He gathered his tools, climbed his ladder, and began pulling away the damaged bark to assess what needed replacing. Moira was inside preparing their midday meal when she heard the crack. Bark that looked solid from below had rotted through underneath. When Duncan put his weight on a section he thought was stable, it gave way completely. He fell 12 feet, landing hard on his back on the frozen ground beside the cabin. Moira ran outside to find him conscious, but struggling to breathe. She called for help. Neighbors came quickly. They carried Duncan inside and made him as comfortable as possible, but the damage was internal and severe. He died 3 hours later, struggling for air until the end, with Moira holding his hand. The settlement helped her bury Duncan on a hillside above the creek. They offered condolences and practical support. Several men told her she should go back east, that a woman alone could not maintain a homestead. Alistair Cameron, who functioned as the settlement's informal leader, suggested she might want to stay with his family until she decided what to do. Moira thanked them all politely and returned to her cabin alone. She spent the first week in a fog of grief, barely eating, sitting for hours staring at nothing. But in the second week something shifted. She found herself looking at the roof that had killed her husband, the rotted bark, the inadequate pole structure, the fundamental weakness of a building method that everyone used because it was fast and easy, not because it was good. Duncan had died because their roof failed. How many others had been injured or killed the same way? How many roofs across the settlement were quietly rotting, waiting to collapse or cause accidents? Moira decided she would not leave, and she would not rebuild using methods that had proven deadly. The social pressure started immediately. Frontier settlements ran on unspoken rules about who did what and how people were expected to behave. Widows, especially young widows without children, were expected to either return to family back east or remarry quickly. A woman alone on a homestead claim was unusual enough to make people uncomfortable. The fact that Moira intended to stay and work the land herself violated expectations that most settlers did not even realize they held until someone broke them. Fergus MacLeod made his opinions clear within 2 weeks of Duncan's death. He stopped by Moira's cabin ostensibly to offer help, but actually to deliver a lecture about practicality. His wife had died the previous year, leaving him with 3 children to raise. He needed a woman to help manage his household. Moira needed a man to maintain her property. The solution seemed obvious to him. When Moira politely declined his implied proposal, Fergus became less polite. He told her she was being foolish and prideful. He said a woman could not survive alone. He predicted she would fail and end up depending on charity from neighbors who had their own families to feed. Moira listened without arguing and closed the door when he finished. She had no interest in remarrying, especially not to Fergus MacLeod. She had loved Duncan. His death had broken something in her that would not heal quickly. But beyond grief, she felt something else. Anger at the waste of it. Fury at the casual acceptance of building methods that failed regularly and killed people through that failure. Duncan should not have died. The roof should not have rotted. Better construction would have prevented the accident. She began examining every aspect of her cabin with critical attention. The bark roof showed rot in a dozen places. Water had penetrated wherever bark strips overlapped imperfectly. The poles underneath were wet and soft. In another year, the entire structure would need replacing. She looked at neighboring cabins and saw the same problems everywhere. Bark roofs lasted 3 to 5 years at best. Sod roofs, which some settlers used, leaked constantly and collapsed under snow weight. Wooden shingles worked better, but required significant labor to split and install, and they still failed at weak points where water penetrated. Every common roofing method had serious flaws. Bark rotted, sod collapsed, shakes split and lifted in wind. All of them required constant maintenance and eventual complete replacement. All of them failed in ways that could injure or kill the people living underneath. The more Moira studied the problem, the more obsessed she became with finding a better solution. She started spending her days walking through the pine forests that surrounded the settlement. The walks helped with grief, giving her movement and purpose. But they also let her observe how nature handled the same problems human builders struggled with. Pine trees shed snow effortlessly. Their needles repelled water. The forest floor stayed relatively dry, even during heavy rain, because thick layers of fallen needles created a natural waterproof barrier. May brought warmer weather and the seasonal work of planting and maintaining a frontier homestead. Moira kept up with necessary tasks, tending her small garden and caring for the 2 milk cows Duncan had purchased the previous year. But every spare moment she walked in the pine forests. She was not hunting or gathering food. She was studying. Neighbors who saw her wandering among the trees with no apparent purpose began to talk. Fergus MacLeod told anyone who would listen that the widow was losing her mind to grief, that her strange behavior proved she needed someone to take charge of her affairs. Moira ignored the gossip and continued her observations. She noticed how pine boughs shed water. Rain hit the needles and ran off immediately, following the natural angle of the branches down toward the trunk and then to the ground. Very little water actually penetrated to the inner branches. She noticed how snow behaved on pine trees during early spring storms. It accumulated briefly, then slid off as the slick needles provided no purchase for the weight to grip. She watched how the flexible branches bent under load rather than breaking, distributing weight along their entire length. The forest floor fascinated her most. Decades of fallen pine needles had created layers 6 to 8 inches thick in some places. When it rained, water did not penetrate this layer easily. The needles interlocked in a dense mat that shed water sideways, channeling it along the ground surface rather than letting it soak through. Moira knelt and examined the structure closely. The needles lay in random, overlapping patterns, each layer resting on the one below, creating countless tiny air pockets. When she dug down through the layers, she found that even after heavy rain, the needles 3 inches down were completely dry. She started collecting needles experimentally. She gathered armfuls and brought them back to her cabin, spreading them on the ground in thick layers to test their properties. She poured water on them and watched how it ran off. She packed them down to see how much they compressed. She studied how they interlocked naturally, the tiny barbs along each needle catching on neighboring needles to create a cohesive mat. An idea was forming, still vague, but growing more concrete with each observation. Birds provided another lesson. Moira watched robins and sparrows building nests in the pines. They used small twigs as framework, but they lined everything with softer materials, including pine needles. The needles provided insulation and water resistance. Nests built with pine needle lining stayed dry inside even during rainstorms. The natural properties of the needles, the resin coating, the interlocking structure, the air pockets between individual needles, all combined to create effective weatherproofing without any human engineering. By early June, Moira had a clear concept. If she could bundle pine needles densely enough and layer them properly, she could create a roof covering that would shed water like the forest floor, shed snow like pine boughs, and provide insulation through trapped air like bird nests. The technique would require gathering enormous quantities of needles and developing a method to bind them into manageable bundles. It would take time, but time was something she had. June of 1852 brought long days perfect for outdoor work. While other settlers focused on crops and livestock, Moira began her pine needle harvest. She started each morning walking into the forest with canvas sacks sewn from an old tent. The work was tedious and back-breaking. She raked needles from the forest floor, gathering only the driest material from the top layers. Wet or rotting needles would not work. She needed needles that were brown and fully dried, but not yet broken down by decay. The first week she experimented with collection methods. Raking by hand was slow. She fashioned a simple wooden rake with wide-spaced teeth that let her gather larger quantities more quickly. She learned to identify the best collection areas, south-facing slopes where sun exposure kept the forest floor dry, areas beneath mature pines where decades of needlefall had created thick deposits, places where wind had piled needles in natural drifts against fallen logs or rocks. She brought gathered needles back to her cabin and spread them on the ground to ensure they were completely dry. Then she began developing a bundling technique. She experimented with different binding materials. Twisted grass rotted too quickly. Rawhide strips worked, but were expensive and scarce. She settled on willow bark stripped from young willows growing along the creek and processed into flexible strips. The willow bark was strong, resistant to rot, and freely available. Her bundling method evolved through trial and error. She laid needles parallel, all pointing the same direction, and compressed them into tight cylinders approximately 6 inches in diameter. Length varied initially, but she settled on 18 inches as optimal. Shorter bundles required more pieces to cover an area. Longer bundles were unwieldy and difficult to work with. She wrapped each bundle tightly with willow bark strips, binding at 3 points along the length to maintain compression. By the end of June, she had created 200 bundles. They sat stacked beside her cabin, golden brown cylinders that looked like nothing anyone in the settlement had seen before. Neighbors passing by stared at the growing pile with confusion and amusement. What was the widow doing with all those pine needles? The question spread through the settlement, and the answers people invented were rarely charitable. Alistair Cameron stopped by one afternoon in late June. He was a fair man, older than most settlers, with gray in his beard and a reputation for even-handedness. He examined the bundles carefully, lifting one to test its weight and density. He asked Moira what she planned to do with them. She explained her idea for a pine needle thatched roof. Cameron listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said the idea was unusual, but he saw no harm in her trying it. He advised her to be careful working on the roof alone and offered to send his son to help if she needed assistance. Moira thanked him, but said she would manage. Fergus MacLeod had a different reaction. He saw the bundles and laughed loud enough for half the settlement to hear. He called it the widow's folly. He said she was wasting time gathering trash when she should be finding a man to provide for her. He predicted the whole pile would rot by autumn. July brought hot weather and afternoon thunderstorms that tested the plains with wind and heavy rain. Moira used the storms as opportunities to refine her understanding of how pine needle bundles handled water. She built a small test structure behind her cabin, a simple frame 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, angled at various pitches. She covered sections with bundles laid in different patterns, overlapping them like shingles, each bundle positioned so its lower end extended over the upper end of the bundle below it. The first heavy rain revealed immediate problems. Bundles laid too loosely let water penetrate between them. Water followed gravity but also found sideways paths through any gap. She needed tighter coverage and better overlap. She experimented with compression, binding bundles more tightly to reduce their diameter. She tested overlap distances, finding that each bundle needed to extend at least 4 inches over the one below to ensure water ran off rather than penetrating. The angle of the roof pitch mattered enormously. Shallow angles let water sit on the surface, eventually finding its way through even tight bundling. Steeper angles encouraged water to run off quickly. She tested pitches from 20 degrees up to 50 degrees. Below 30 degrees, water penetrated during sustained rain. Above 40 degrees, water ran off almost immediately. she settled on 45 degrees as her target pitch. It was steeper than most frontier cabin roofs, but the extra angle was necessary for the system to work properly. She also discovered that bundle thickness created unexpected benefits. When she laid bundles in multiple layers, stacking them 2 and 3 deep, the lower layers remained completely dry even during hours of rain. The upper layer shed most water. Whatever penetrated was absorbed by the middle layer. The bottom layer never got wet. This meant the underside of her roof, the part that would face the interior of her cabin, would stay dry regardless of weather conditions. No dripping, no moisture seeping through to damage interior spaces. The insulation properties became obvious during temperature swings between day and night. She placed a thermometer under her test roof section and another in open air. During hot July days, the shaded space under the pine needle thatch stayed 15 degrees cooler than ambient air temperature. At night, it retained heat longer. The thick layer of bundled needles, with countless tiny air pockets trapped between individual needles, created remarkable thermal mass. This was not something she had anticipated, but it was perhaps the most valuable discovery of all. Eileen Donnelly started visiting regularly in mid-July. She was younger than Moira, perhaps 25, with red hair and a quiet manner. She brought food occasionally, but mostly she came to watch Moira work. She asked questions about the bundling process and the testing structure. Unlike the men who mocked or dismissed the project, Eileen seemed genuinely curious. By late July, Moira was ready to begin actual construction on her cabin roof. She started by dismantling the existing bark covering. This was dangerous work that required climbing under the roof structure and tearing away material that had protected the cabin for more than a year. She worked carefully, removing bark strips and examining the pole rafters underneath. Some were rotted and needed replacing. She cut new poles from straight young pines, stripped the bark, and let them season in the sun for a week before installing them. The settlement watched her progress with a mixture of amusement and concern. Women worried she would fall and injure herself. Men considered her project a waste of effort that would end in failure. Fergus MacLeod made his opinions known at every opportunity. He stopped by her cabin repeatedly, ostensibly to check on her safety, but actually to criticize her methods. He told her the roof pitch she was building was too steep and structurally unsound. He said pine needle bundles would blow away in the first strong wind. He predicted the whole thing would collapse under snow weight come winter. Other men joined the mockery. At the settlement's small trading post, Moira's roof became a standard topic of conversation. They called it the Needle Woman's Madness. They made jokes about building roofs from grass and leaves. They wagered on how long it would take to fail. Some of the humor was good-natured, the kind of teasing that frontier communities engaged in regularly. But some carried an edge of genuine hostility. A woman working alone on an unusual building project challenged assumptions about what women could or should do. Her refusal to accept help or guidance from men who considered themselves experts made that challenge more pointed. Several men offered to fix her roof properly. They volunteered to install bark or split shakes the right way so she would have a real roof before winter. Moira declined politely every time. She explained that she was testing a different approach based on natural principles she had observed. Most walked away shaking their heads. A few became genuinely angry. One man told her she was being stubborn and prideful, that her refusal to accept help would result in her freezing to death when winter came and her foolish needle roof failed. Moira kept working. She had 400 bundles completed by the end of July and needed at least 200 more. She continued her morning routine of gathering needles from the forest. She spent afternoons bundling and evenings working on the roof structure itself. The physical labor was exhausting. Her hands developed calluses and then blisters that broke and formed new calluses. Her back ached from bending over bundles and climbing the ladder to install roof poles, but she did not stop. Alistair Cameron visited again in early August. He climbed her ladder and examined the roof frame she had built. The steep pitch concerned him from a structural standpoint. He questioned whether the pole rafters would support the weight of the thick thatching she planned. Moira showed him her calculations, rough drawings she had made estimating weight distribution. Cameron studied them and admitted her reasoning seemed sound. August brought the hottest weather of the year, but Moira worked through it. The roof frame required precision she had not anticipated. Standard cabin roofs used simple construction, poles laid across the walls at shallow angles. Her design demanded something more complex. The 45-degree pitch meant the roof structure would rise 7 feet from wall top to peak on her cabin that measured 14 feet wide. That height created stress points that simple pole construction could not handle adequately. She spent 3 days studying the problem before beginning work. She sketched designs in charcoal on flat pieces of bark, working through structural issues on paper before committing to construction. The solution involved creating triangular bracing at regular intervals along the roof length. She cut poles and notched them to form rigid triangles that would support the weight of the thick thatching without sagging. Each triangle consisted of 2 angled rafters meeting at the peak and a horizontal tie beam connecting their lower ends. Installing these triangular frames required strength and balance she sometimes barely managed. She worked alone, wrestling heavy poles into position while perched on the cabin walls. Several times she nearly fell. Once a pole slipped from her grip and crashed to the ground, narrowly missing her foot, but gradually the structure took shape. 6 triangular frames spaced evenly along the 18-foot length of her cabin. Ridge pole connecting all the peaks, horizontal purlins running between frames to provide attachment points for the thatching bundles. The frame looked skeletal and strange. The steep pitch made the cabin appear taller and narrower than it actually was. Neighbors passing by stopped to stare. The structure violated every expectation of how a cabin roof should look. Fergus MacLeod examined it from a distance and declared it would collapse under its own weight before she ever got thatching installed. He said the whole project was proof that women should not attempt construction work without male supervision. Moira ignored him and moved to the next phase. She needed horizontal lath running perpendicular to the purlins, creating a grid pattern across the entire roof surface. The lath would provide attachment points for the pine needle bundles. She cut straight branches from willow and aspen, selecting pieces approximately 2 inches in diameter. She stripped the bark and shaped them into uniform lengths. Then, she lashed them to the purlins using twisted willow bark rope she made herself during evening hours. The lath spacing mattered. Too far apart and bundles would sag between attachment points. Too close and she would waste materials creating unnecessary structure. She settled on 12-inch spacing, creating a grid of horizontal lines across the angled roof surface. The work was repetitive and time-consuming. Each lath piece had to be positioned exactly and lashed securely. By the end of August, she had completed the structural framework. The cabin looked strange and unfinished, but the bones were solid. Eileen Donnelly helped occasionally during this phase, holding poles steady while Moira lashed them, or passing up materials while Moira worked on the roof structure. The help was valuable, but more important was having someone who believed the project might succeed. Eileen never mocked or questioned. She simply helped when she could and watched with genuine interest when she could not. September brought cooler weather and the first hints of autumn. Moira began the actual thatching process with 600 bundles completed and another 200 in production. She started at the bottom edge of the roof on the east side, working from the eave upward toward the peak. The technique she had developed through testing now had to work at full scale across 200 square feet of steeply angled surface. Each bundle was positioned horizontally, perpendicular to the roof slope, with its lower end extending 2 feet beyond the wall edge to create the protective eave. She lashed the bundle to the horizontal lath using willow bark strips, binding at multiple points to prevent shifting. The next bundle up overlapped the first by 4 inches, covering the lashing points and creating a continuous surface. She worked methodically across the width of the roof, completing one horizontal course before starting the next. The physical challenge was significant. The steep pitch meant she could not simply stand on the roof surface. She built a simple scaffolding platform that hung from the peak and could be moved horizontally as she completed each section. She worked from this platform, reaching down to position and lash bundles while maintaining her balance on a narrow board. The work required constant attention. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and she could fall 15 feet to the ground. The bundles themselves performed exactly as her testing had predicted. They interlocked naturally, the individual pine needles from adjacent bundles meshing together to create a cohesive surface. As she added more layers, the roof began to take on thickness and solidity. The golden brown color caught the September sunlight, making the cabin visible from a considerable distance. The unusual appearance attracted attention from everyone in the settlement. After completing the first layer across the entire roof surface, Moira began a second layer. This was the innovation that would provide true weatherproofing and insulation. She positioned the second layer bundles to cover the gaps and lashing points of the first layer, creating complete redundancy. If water somehow penetrated the first layer, the second layer would stop it. The process doubled her work, but also doubled the effectiveness. By mid-September, she had 2 complete layers installed on the east side of the roof. The thickness was impressive, nearly 10 inches of densely packed pine needles, creating a solid mass that looked both strange and somehow natural. She tested it by throwing buckets of water on the surface. The water ran off immediately, following the steep pitch down to the extended eaves and dripping off the ends. Not a drop penetrated to the lath structure underneath. Fergus MacLeod visited during this phase and offered his assessment without being asked. He said the roof looked like a bird nest built by something drunk and confused. He predicted it would blow apart in the first autumn windstorm. He said she had wasted months of work on something that could not possibly function. Moira listened without responding and returned to work after he left. She was past caring what Fergus MacLeod thought. The west side of the roof went faster. She understood the technique fully now and worked with practiced efficiency. Late September brought a settlement gathering that functioned as the community's informal governance. 20s. Families lived within 5 miles of the trading post, and representatives from most households attended these monthly meetings. Topics ranged from shared resource management to resolving disputes to planning for winter preparations. The meetings happened in the largest cabin, owned by Alistair Cameron, and usually lasted several hours as people discussed whatever issues affected the community. Moira attended rarely, preferring to avoid the social scrutiny that came with being a widow living alone. But she heard about the discussions from Eileen Donnelly, who attended with her husband and reported back on what was said. In the September meeting, Moira's roof became a significant topic. Fergus MacLeod raised concerns about what he called the widow's dangerous project. He argued that her unusual construction methods posed risks, not just to herself, but potentially to others if the structure failed catastrophically. His reasoning was convoluted, but not entirely without logic. If her roof collapsed during winter, she would need rescue and support from neighbors. If the collapse injured her seriously, someone would need to provide medical care and possibly long-term assistance. Her refusal to build properly using proven methods meant she was potentially creating a burden the community would have to bear. Therefore, he argued, the community had a right to intervene and insist she either build correctly or accept help from men who knew what they were doing. Several men supported this position. They viewed Moira's independence as problematic and her unconventional building methods as evidence she needed guidance. Women in the meeting remained mostly silent. Frontier culture did not encourage women to speak at community gatherings, especially on matters related to construction or other traditionally male domains. But according to Eileen's account, several women exchanged glances that suggested they had opinions they were not voicing publicly. Alistair Cameron defended Moira's right to build as she saw fit. He pointed out that she owned her property outright, having filed proper claim after Duncan's death. Her building methods, however unusual, were her own business unless they somehow threatened others. He noted that she had not asked for help or resources from the community. She was working independently and taking full responsibility for the outcome. Cameron argued that frontier life required allowing people to make their own decisions and live with the consequences. Interference should be reserved for situations where someone posed clear danger to others. The debate continued for over an hour. No formal decision was made because the gathering had no official authority to make binding decisions, but the discussion revealed deep divisions in how people viewed Moira's situation. Some saw her as a stubborn woman who refused to accept her proper role. Others saw her as someone exercising legitimate independence. A few viewed her project with genuine curiosity, interested in whether her unusual methods might actually work. Moira learned about the meeting from Eileen 2 days later. She felt anger at being discussed like a problem to be solved, but also understood that frontier communities functioned through collective concern and mutual support. October brought the final phase of construction and the most technically demanding challenge. The ridge cap, where the two angled roof surfaces met at the peak, represented the most vulnerable point for water penetration. Standard roofs failed most often at the ridge because water running down both sides converged at the peak and found any weakness in the seal. Moira had watched this failure pattern on cabin after cabin during rainstorms. She needed a solution that would handle convergent water flow without allowing any penetration. Her approach involved creating a doubled ridge structure. She started by installing bundles along both sides of the peak, angling them so they met but did not overlap directly. This created a V-shaped channel along the entire ridgeline. Then she took specially prepared bundles, thicker and more tightly compressed than standard ones, and laid them lengthwise along the ridge channel. These cap bundles covered the vulnerable joint where the two roof surfaces met. She lashed them extensively, creating redundant attachment points every 6 inches along the 18-foot ridge length. But she added another element based on observations from her forest walks. She had noticed how certain tree barks shed water particularly well. Birch bark, when layered properly, was nearly waterproof. She had gathered sections of birch bark during summer and stored them flat under weights to prevent curling. Now she positioned these bark sections under the ridge cap bundles, creating a secondary waterproof barrier. The bark would shed any water that somehow penetrated the pine needle layer above it. The redundant system meant 2 separate failures would have to occur simultaneously for water to reach the interior. The eave treatment required similar attention. Water running off the roof would drip from the extended bundle ends, but she needed to ensure that water did not run back along the underside of the eaves and penetrate where the roof met the walls. She angled the final course of bundles slightly downward, creating a drip edge that threw water clear of the wall structure. She also applied a thick coating of pine resin she had collected and boiled down to the exposed ends of the bundles. The resin sealed the cut ends and provided additional water resistance. The entire roof was complete by mid-October. 2 layers of densely bundled pine needles, 12 inches thick at most points, covering 200 square feet of steeply angled surface. Extended eaves projecting 2 feet beyond the walls on all sides. Carefully sealed ridge cap and properly designed drip edges. The structure weighed perhaps 800 pounds total, distributed across the robust frame she had built. The golden-brown surface caught afternoon sunlight and glowed with an almost amber quality that made the cabin distinctive across the entire settlement. Moira climbed down from her final day of work and stood back to examine what she had built. The roof looked nothing like anything else in the territory. It appeared thick and shaggy, almost organic, more like something grown than constructed. But it represented 5 months of focused work, hundreds of hours of gathering and bundling and testing and installing. It embodied everything she had learned about water flow and thermal mass and structural integrity. Whether it would actually work through a full winter remained to be seen, but she had done everything she knew how to do. Late October brought the first serious rains of autumn, cold storms sweeping down from the north that lasted for days and tested every structure in the settlement. Moira waited inside her cabin during the first storm, listening to rain hammer against her new roof, watching for any signs of leakage. She had placed buckets and pans strategically around the interior, positioned under spots where she thought penetration might occur if the system had weaknesses. She sat at her small table with a lantern burning and waited. The rain started mid-morning and continued through the afternoon into evening. Heavy downpours alternated with lighter, steady rain. Wind drove the water at angles, testing the roof from different directions. Moira walked around her cabin interior repeatedly, checking every potential weak point. The ridge line, where water from both sides converged. The eaves, where water ran off. The corners, where roof structure met walls. She found nothing. The interior remained completely dry. Not a single drip, not even moisture forming on the underside of the roof structure. By the second day of rain, she relaxed slightly. The roof was performing exactly as she had designed it to perform. Water ran off the steep pitch immediately, never sitting on the surface long enough to find penetration routes. The thick layering provided redundancy that stopped anything that got past the first barrier. The extended eaves threw water clear of the walls, preventing the kind of water damage that plagued most frontier cabins, where rain running off roofs soaked into log walls and caused rot. She also noticed something she had hoped for but not fully expected. The cabin stayed warmer during the cold rain than it ever had with the old bark roof. Her small fire heated the interior efficiently, and the heat did not escape rapidly through the roof. The 12 inches of pine needle insulation trapped warmth inside, creating a stable temperature that required far less firewood to maintain. She burned perhaps half the wood she would normally use during cold, wet weather, a significant savings that would matter enormously during deep winter. Neighbors noticed immediately when the rain stopped. Other cabins showed the usual signs of roof leakage: buckets positioned under drips, damp spots on interior walls, the smell of mildew starting in corners where water had penetrated. Moira's cabin remained dry. Word spread quickly. Several people stopped by to ask if she had experienced any leaks. She invited them inside to see for themselves. The interior was warm and dry, showing no evidence of water penetration despite 3 days of heavy rain. Fergus MacLeod dismissed the success as luck. He said one rainstorm proved nothing. He predicted winter would reveal the roof's fundamental flaws. Snow weight would crush the structure, or winter winds would tear the thatching away. He said she should not become confident based on surviving a little autumn rain. Real tests were coming, and the needle roof would fail when conditions became truly harsh. Eileen Donnelly had a different response. She asked detailed questions about the construction process, taking notes on a piece of bark using a charcoal stick. She wanted to know how many bundles Moira had used, how she had created the layering pattern, how she had sealed the ridge. November brought cold temperatures and the first snowfall of the season. It was not heavy snow, just 3 inches that fell overnight and covered the settlement in white. Morning revealed how different roofs handled snow accumulation. Most cabin roofs held the snow in even layers. The shallow pitches, common to frontier construction, did not encourage snow to slide off, so it simply sat there until it melted or someone climbed up to shovel it away. Moira's roof behaved differently. She woke to find her roof nearly clear. During the night, as snow accumulated, the combination of steep pitch and the slick surface of the compressed pine needles had caused the snow to slide off in sections. By morning, only thin patches remained near the peak where the angle was steepest and sliding was slowest. The extended eaves showed piles of snow on the ground where it had fallen, but the roof itself carried almost no weight. The contrast with neighboring cabins was obvious to anyone who looked. Moira stood outside in the cold morning air and studied what had happened. The system worked even better than she had anticipated. Snow could not grip the dense pine needle surface. The steep angle overcame whatever friction might have developed. As soon as accumulation reached a certain thickness, gravity pulled it downward and the whole layer slid off cleanly. This meant her roof would never carry dangerous snow weight. No matter how much snow fell, it would shed itself naturally without requiring human intervention. The practical implications were significant. Every winter, settlers spent dangerous hours on their roofs shoveling snow to prevent collapse. Men fell from roofs regularly. Some were injured seriously. A few died. The work was cold, exhausting, and unavoidable because snow accumulation could overload a roof structure and cause catastrophic failure. Moira would never need to shovel her roof. The design eliminated the problem entirely through passive engineering that required no human effort. Neighbors noticed the difference immediately. By mid-morning, several people had walked past Moira's cabin specifically to observe the snow-shedding phenomenon. Some showed genuine interest and asked questions about how the roof was constructed. Others remained skeptical, arguing that one small snowfall proved nothing. Fergus McLeod made sure everyone heard his prediction that real winter snow, heavy and wet, would behave differently. He said the needle roof might shed light powder, but would fail under serious accumulation. More snow fell in late November. 5 inches this time, wet, heavy snow that clung to everything. Again, Moira's roof shed the accumulation naturally. Again, neighboring roofs held the weight until men climbed up to shovel. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Her roof worked in ways standard construction did not. The innovation she had developed through observation and methodical testing was proving itself under real conditions. Still, skeptics dismissed the evidence. They said winter had barely started. They predicted January and February would bring conditions that would finally reveal the roof's inadequacy. Moira did not argue with skeptics. She simply continued her normal winter preparations, cutting firewood and preserving food, confident that her roof would continue performing as designed. Eileen Donnelly visited more frequently now, asking detailed questions about every aspect of the construction. She admitted her own cabin was cold and leaked constantly. January of 1853 brought the blizzard that old-timers would reference for decades afterward. The storm developed over 3 days, building from light snow to conditions that made visibility impossible beyond 20 feet. Wind howled across the plains and through the settlement with force that shook cabin walls and found every gap in every structure. Snow fell continuously, heavy wet snow that accumulated at rates no one had seen before. By the second day, drifts reached 6 feet in protected areas, and even exposed ground held 3 feet of accumulation. Moira stayed inside her cabin with her fire burning steadily and watched through her small window as the storm raged. Her cabin remained warm despite the extreme cold outside. The thick pine needle roof insulation kept heat from escaping, and the tight construction she had maintained throughout the building process prevented wind from penetrating. She burned less firewood during the blizzard than she would have used during a normal cold day with her old roof. The thermal efficiency was remarkable, turning her cabin into a warm refuge while the storm tried to freeze everything outside. She could not see other cabins during the worst of the storm, but she heard sounds that concerned her. Cracking noises carried on the wind, shouts from distant voices, the kinds of sounds that suggested structures were failing under stress. On the second afternoon of the blizzard, she heard a particularly loud crack from the direction of Fergus McLeod's cabin. The sound was sharp and clear even through the storm noise, the unmistakable sound of wood breaking under load. Her own roof continued shedding snow as it had during smaller storms. She could not see the process during the blizzard, but she could hear it. Periodic sliding sounds as accumulated snow reached critical mass and slid off the steep pitch, falling to the ground around her cabin. The process was continuous and automatic. Her roof never carried more than a few inches of snow at any time because the system she had designed eliminated accumulation through passive mechanics that required no human intervention. By the third day, the storm began to ease. Wind decreased and snow fell less heavily. Visibility improved enough to see neighboring structures. Moira looked out to assess damage and saw immediately that Fergus McLeod's cabin had suffered catastrophic failure. A section of his roof had collapsed inward under snow weight, leaving a gap approximately 6 feet wide where sky was visible through the broken structure. Snow had poured through the opening, filling part of his interior. The cabin was uninhabitable in its current state. She saw figures moving through the snow, people evacuating McLeod's cabin and heading toward other structures. She put on her heavy coat and opened her door. The cold was brutal, but the storm had calmed enough to make travel possible. Fergus McLeod appeared through the snow with his wife and 3 children, all of them carrying whatever belongings they had managed to grab before abandoning their cabin. They were heading toward Alistair Cameron's place, but Moira's cabin was closer. She called out to them. Fergus stopped, clearly reluctant to accept help from the woman whose roof he had mocked for 8 months. But his children were cold and frightened, and his wife looked exhausted. Moira told them to come inside. After a moment of visible internal struggle, Fergus nodded and brought his family to her door. Moira's cabin, designed for 1 person, suddenly housed 6. The McLeod family occupied most of the floor space, spreading blankets and arranging themselves as comfortably as possible in the limited area. The children, ranging in age from 5 to 11, were cold and scared but uninjured. Fergus's wife, Margaret, was quiet and clearly embarrassed by their situation. Fergus himself said almost nothing for the first hour, sitting near the fire and staring at the flames while snow melted from his coat. The cabin's warmth became apparent immediately to the newcomers. Despite housing 6 people instead of 1, the interior temperature remained comfortable with Moira's normal fire. The pine needle roof insulation was so effective that body heat from 6 people contributed measurably to warming the space. Margaret commented on the warmth after an hour, saying she could not remember the last time she had been truly warm during winter. Her own cabin had been drafty and cold, even with a large fire burning constantly. The blizzard continued through that night and into the next morning, though with decreasing intensity. Other families in the settlement faced similar crises. 2 more roofs suffered partial collapses under snow weight. Several cabins developed dangerous leaks where snowmelt found its way through damaged roofing. Alistair Cameron's cabin took in 3 families whose homes had become uninhabitable. The storm had overwhelmed the settlement's infrastructure, revealing how inadequate standard construction was for extreme weather conditions. During the second night of sheltering the McLeod family, Fergus finally spoke about what had happened. His roof had been accumulating snow for 2 days. He had been unable to climb up and shovel because the storm made that work impossible. He had heard the structure groaning under the weight and knew failure was likely, but there was nothing he could do. When the collapse came, it was sudden and complete. The center section of his roof, weakened by previous repairs and age, had simply given up under the load. If his family had been sleeping in that part of the cabin, they could have been killed. He looked at Moira when he said this. For the first time since she had known him, Fergus McLeod appeared uncertain and humbled. He admitted he had been wrong about her roof. He said he had mocked something he did not understand because it was different from what he knew. He asked how her roof was able to shed snow so effectively when his had failed so catastrophically. Moira explained the principles she had observed and applied: the steep pitch, the slick surface, the natural sliding action that prevented accumulation. She spoke without judgment or satisfaction, simply sharing information with someone who was finally ready to listen. The storm ended on the 4th day. Settlement residents emerged to assess damage and begin repairs. 7 cabins had suffered significant roof damage. Fergus McLeod's was the worst, but others needed extensive work before they would be weatherproof again. Moira's cabin stood unchanged, its thick golden roof intact and functional, having protected 7 people through the worst storm anyone could remember. The contrast was undeniable and impossible to dismiss. Alistair Cameron visited 2 days after the storm ended. He examined Moira's roof carefully, asking detailed questions about construction methods and materials. Spring of 1853 brought a transformation in how the settlement viewed Moira and her construction methods. The blizzard had provided dramatic proof that her approach worked better than standard techniques. Men who had mocked her for months now asked questions about how she had built her roof. Women who had watched silently now expressed interest in learning the technique for their own homes. The innovation that had been dismissed as widow's folly became something people wanted to understand and replicate. Eileen Donnelly was the first to commit to building a pine needle roof on her own cabin. She approached Moira in early April and asked for detailed instruction. Moira agreed immediately and spent several days teaching Eileen everything she had learned. They walked through the forests together, with Moira explaining how to identify the best gathering areas and select properly dried needles. She demonstrated bundling techniques, showing Eileen how to achieve the right compression and secure the willow bark binding. She explained the layering system and the importance of proper overlap. Eileen was a quick student who understood intuitively what Moira was describing. She began gathering needles in late April and had 300 bundles completed by mid-May. Her husband, initially skeptical, became supportive after seeing how seriously Eileen approached the project. He helped with the heavy work of rebuilding their roof frame to the steeper pitch required for the system to function. By June, Eileen's cabin had a pine needle roof that replicated Moira's design, with minor adaptations for her cabin's different dimensions. Other women began similar projects through the summer. Margaret MacLeod, still grateful for the shelter Moira had provided during the blizzard, convinced Fergus to let her rebuild their damaged roof using pine needle thatching. Fergus agreed reluctantly but provided labor for the structural work while Margaret handled the gathering and bundling. 2 other families started pine needle roof projects, both led by women who had watched Moira's success and wanted similar protection for their homes. The technique spread through an informal network of women sharing knowledge and helping each other with the labor-intensive work. Moira found herself at the center of this network, answering questions and offering guidance to anyone who asked. She visited construction sites to provide advice on specific problems. She helped troubleshoot issues with bundling compression or layering patterns. The knowledge she had developed through months of solitary work became communal property, shared freely with anyone willing to invest the time and effort required. Men's attitudes shifted more slowly. Some acknowledged the technique's effectiveness, but considered it too time-consuming for practical adoption. Others admitted the results were impressive, but could not bring themselves to follow building methods developed by a woman. But practical necessity gradually overcame pride. When cabins needed roof replacement, more families chose pine needle thatching, despite the extra work involved. The superior performance during the blizzard had demonstrated value that could not be ignored. By the fall of 1853, 6 cabins in the settlement had pine needle roofs. By the following spring, that number had doubled. The roofs became known as Callahan roofs, named after Moira, though she never claimed credit or sought recognition. The years following the Great Blizzard saw Moira's roofing technique spread beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers passing through the area noticed the unusual golden-brown roofs and asked about them. Word spread along frontier trade routes that a settlement in Montana Territory had developed superior roofing methods particularly suited to harsh winter conditions. Settlers establishing new homesteads sought information about the technique before building their first structures. The innovation moved organically through networks of people sharing practical knowledge about survival in difficult environments. By 1856, Variations of the Callahan roof appeared in settlements throughout the Northern Territories. The basic principles remained consistent across adaptations: steep pitch for snow shedding, dense bundling of available materials, multiple layers for redundancy and insulation, extended eaves for wall protection. But specific materials varied based on local availability. In areas without pine forests, settlers experimented with other needled evergreens. Some used cedar boughs, others tried juniper. A few adapted the technique using prairie grass bundled and layered in similar fashion. Professional builders began incorporating elements of Moira's design into their standard practices. The recognition that roof pitch affected snow accumulation influenced construction across regions with heavy snowfall. The understanding that insulation could be built into roof structure rather than added afterward changed how people thought about thermal efficiency. The principle that passive design could eliminate maintenance requirements inspired innovation in other aspects of frontier building. Moira's observation-based engineering influenced construction philosophy beyond the specific technique she had developed. Moira herself became known throughout the region as a skilled builder. Families establishing new homesteads sought her advice during planning stages. She traveled occasionally to other settlements to consult on construction projects, always returning to her own cabin within a few weeks. She never charged for her knowledge, sharing information freely with anyone who asked. But people insisted on paying for her time and expertise, and she accepted payment gracefully when offered. The income provided security and independence that few frontier women achieved. She remained unmarried, despite occasional interest from men in the settlement and surrounding areas. The loss of Duncan had changed something fundamental in her. She valued her independence and found satisfaction in her work that marriage would have complicated. Frontier culture struggled to understand a woman who chose to remain alone by preference rather than circumstance. But Moira's demonstrated competence and the respect she had earned through her innovation gave her a degree of social freedom that would have been impossible otherwise. The original cabins, built with pine needle roofs in 1852 and 1853, remained structurally sound through the 1860s. The roofs required minimal maintenance, occasional replacement of bundles damaged by falling branches or extreme weather, but the basic structure lasted far longer than traditional bark or shake roofs. Moira's own roof, the first and most carefully constructed, showed remarkably little degradation after 15 years. The dense bundling and quality materials she had used created durability that exceeded even her expectations. By 1865, Callahan roofs were common enough in Montana Territory that they no longer attracted particular notice. The innovation had become standard practice, absorbed into the collective knowledge of how to build effectively in harsh climates. Moira Callahan died in March of 1872 at the age of 58 in the cabin she had rebuilt 20 years earlier. The cause was pneumonia, common enough among frontier settlers and particularly dangerous for older individuals. She had been ill for a week before Eileen Donnelly found her too weak to rise from her bed. Eileen brought help, and several women from the settlement took turns caring for Moira during her final days. She died quietly on a cold morning with Eileen holding her hand, much as she had held Duncan's hand 35 years earlier. The settlement buried her on a hillside above the creek, not far from where Duncan had been laid to rest decades before. 20 families attended the funeral, representing both old-timers who remembered the early days and newer settlers who had arrived after Moira's roofing technique had already become standard practice. Alistair Cameron spoke at the service, mentioning her contributions to the community and her willingness to share knowledge that had kept countless families warm and safe. Fergus MacLeod attended with his grown children, silent but present, acknowledging a debt he had never fully articulated. Moira left no will and no close family. Her cabin and the small plot of land it occupied reverted to territorial administration. A young couple claiming adjacent land purchased the cabin and property for a modest sum. They moved in that spring and lived there for 15 years, raising 4 children under the pine needle roof that still shed snow and kept the interior warm through every winter. The roof outlasted Moira by more than a decade before finally requiring replacement in 1884, 32 years after its construction. By the time of Moira's death, hundreds of cabins across the Northern Territories used variations of the technique she had developed. Most people building these roofs had never heard her name. The knowledge had spread so far and been adapted so many times that its origins were lost to many who used it. This was perhaps the truest measure of her innovation's success. It had become ordinary knowledge, no longer associated with a specific person, but simply part of how competent builders worked in regions with heavy snow and cold winters. Moira's gravestone, a simple wooden marker that eventually weathered away, made no mention of her roofing innovation. To the people who knew her at the end of her life, she was simply a woman who had lived independently, built well, and shared her knowledge generously. The dramatic story of her months gathering pine needles while the settlement mocked her had faded into history. But across the Montana Territory and beyond, cabins with steep golden roofs continued protecting families from winter storms, silent testament to what one woman had accomplished through observation, determination, and methodical engineering that solved a problem others had simply accepted as unsolvable. The impossible had become routine, carved not into monuments or recorded in official histories, but built into the structures that sheltered people from wilderness that tested everything human hands created.